Miss Carter, please come forward.
Me?
Yes, you. Mr. Williams specifically requested that you be here.
But I was only his nurse. I don't understand. This is ridiculous. Why would Richard want her standing up there?
Miss Williams, please sit down.
No! I want to know what this woman is doing here. She barely knew my uncle. I'm not here for anything. I just came to say goodbye.
Before his death, Mr. Richard Williams left specific instructions.
And what does that have to do with her?
Everything. Everything. Mr. Williams instructed me to read this aloud in front of everyone. To Jasmine Carter, the woman who gave me back my daughter.
What?
Welcome to Nenya Folktales, where every story teaches you about betrayal, karma, love, and life lessons. If you love emotional stories with crazy twists, subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss a new story every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday by 8 p.m. Now, let's get into today's story. The entire church went silent when the lawyer called the young nurse to the front. Jasmine Carter had been standing quietly at the back of the room, hoping nobody would notice her. She had come to say goodbye to a man she had cared for during the final weeks of his life. She never expected to be called forward in front of hundreds of people. But when the lawyer looked directly at her and said, "Miss Carter, please come here. Mr. Williams left specific instructions that you must be present before we continue." Every eye in the church turned toward her. Jasmine froze. She looked at the coffin in front of her, then at the family sitting in the first row. Richard Williams had been one of the wealthiest businessmen in America. His fortune was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His family had spent the entire morning whispering about his estate, waiting to hear who would receive what. Nobody expected a nurse to be involved, especially not Jasmine. She slowly walked down the aisle. As she approached the front, Richard's niece, Vanessa, stood up. Her face was filled with anger. "What is she doing here?" Vanessa demanded. The lawyer didn't answer her. Instead, he opened a black leather folder and removed a sealed envelope. "This was given to me personally by Mr. Williams 3 days before his death," he said. "He instructed me not to open it until after his funeral." Jasmine's heart began pounding. She had no idea what was inside. But when the lawyer looked at her and said, "He also instructed me to give this to you," she felt the entire room shift. Vanessa immediately shouted that the envelope had to be opened in front of everyone. The lawyer calmly agreed. He broke the seal. Then he read the first line. "To Jasmine Carter, the woman who gave me back something I lost 40 years ago." Jasmine covered her mouth. She had never heard Richard speak those words. And Vanessa suddenly looked terrified, because whatever Richard had written in that letter wasn't just about money. It was about a secret his family had spent decades trying to bury, and Jasmine was about to become the person who exposed it. But 3 months earlier, Jasmine had no idea who Richard Williams was. She was simply a 28-year-old nurse, trying desperately to keep her own family together. Her mother had died several years earlier, leaving Jasmine responsible for her younger brother Marcus and her teenage sister Aaliyah. They lived in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago. Money was always tight. The rent was several weeks behind. Marcus needed money for college applications. Aaliyah needed a new laptop for school. And Jasmine had recently received an eviction notice that she kept hidden beneath a stack of unpaid bills in the kitchen drawer. She didn't tell her siblings. She couldn't. They already depended on her for everything. Every morning, Jasmine woke before sunrise, prepared breakfast, checked that her brother and sister were ready for school, and rushed to the hospital for her shift. She worked overtime whenever she could. She skipped meals when money was short. And whenever her siblings asked if she was tired, she gave them the same answer. "I'm fine." But Jasmine wasn't fine. She was exhausted. She was scared. And she had begun wondering how much longer she could keep pretending she could carry the whole world on her shoulders. Then, one Monday morning, her supervisor assigned her to a patient named Richard Williams. The moment Jasmine heard his name, the other nurses exchanged uncomfortable looks. Richard Williams wasn't an ordinary patient. He was a billionaire, a powerful businessman, and according to the nurses, he was also the most difficult patient in the hospital. He refused medication. He barely ate. He shouted at doctors. He had already made 2 nurses cry, and he had demanded that one nurse be removed from his room because she smiled at him while explaining his treatment. Jasmine was warned before she entered. "Don't take anything he says personally," her supervisor told her. Jasmine nodded and walked toward his room. She opened the door. Richard was sitting beside the window, staring outside. He didn't turn around. He simply said, "If you're here to tell me I need to eat, you can leave." Jasmine stopped. She looked at the untouched breakfast tray beside him. Then she looked at the old man sitting alone in the hospital room. And instead of arguing with him, she quietly pulled a chair toward the window. She sat down. Richard finally turned his head. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Jasmine noticed a photograph sitting beside his bed. It was a picture of a little black girl. She looked about 8 years old. She was smiling directly at the camera. Jasmine didn't ask who she was. She simply looked at the photograph and said, "She looks happy." Richard's expression changed instantly. For the first time since Jasmine entered the room, the anger disappeared from his face. He stared at the photograph. Then he whispered something that Jasmine would never forget. She was. Jasmine looked at him. Richard picked up the photograph with trembling hands. "That was my daughter." And then he said something that made Jasmine realize the angry billionaire everyone feared wasn't angry at all. He was grieving. His daughter had been dead for 40 years. And somehow, after all those years, Richard was still waiting for her to come home. Jasmine didn't know it yet, but that photograph was the beginning of a secret that would eventually lead to her standing beside Richard's coffin, with his entire family watching her, and a shocking inheritance nobody saw coming. Jasmine had no idea that the most difficult patient in the hospital would soon become the most important person in her life. Richard Williams was 71 years old and had spent decades building one of the biggest construction companies in the country. He had money, influence, and everything most people could only dream of, but none of it could save him from the illness that had brought him to the hospital. His cancer had progressed rapidly, and the doctors had already explained that treatment could only give him more time, not a cure. Richard had become bitter. He refused his medication, pushed away his meals, and barely spoke to anyone. Most of the nurses avoided spending more time with him than necessary because they knew he could be difficult. Jasmine, however, didn't see a wealthy businessman or a difficult patient when she entered his room that morning. She saw an elderly man sitting alone beside a window, staring at the rain outside. His breakfast sat untouched on the table. His medication was still sealed beside it. Jasmine checked his chart and quietly walked closer. Richard didn't look at her. "If you're here to convince me to take those pills, save your breath." Jasmine looked at the medication, then back at him. "I'm not here to force you." That made him turn. He looked surprised. Most people who entered his room immediately started telling him what he needed to do. Jasmine simply pulled a chair closer and sat down. Richard stared at her for a moment before asking why she wasn't leaving. Jasmine told him that she had some paperwork to finish and could do it there. She didn't mention that she had noticed how lonely he looked. She didn't want him to feel like she was pitying him. For several minutes, she worked quietly while Richard continued looking out the window. Eventually, he asked where she was from. Jasmine told him she grew up in Chicago and had 2 younger siblings depending on her. Richard asked about her parents. Jasmine hesitated before explaining that her mother had passed away several years earlier and that she had been taking care of her family ever since. Richard looked at her differently after that. He asked how she managed everything. Jasmine simply smiled and said she didn't have much choice. Someone had to do it. That answer stayed with Richard. Over the next few days, Jasmine continued caring for him. She never treated him like a billionaire. She didn't flatter him, ask about his money, or act impressed by his name. She treated him exactly the way she treated every other patient. She made sure he was comfortable, encouraged him to eat, checked his medication, and sometimes sat with him when he didn't feel like talking. Slowly, Richard began changing. He started eating a little more. He began taking his medication without arguing. He even started asking Jasmine questions about her family. One afternoon, Jasmine noticed an old photograph beside his bed. It showed Richard standing beside a little girl who looked about 8 years old. The girl's smile immediately caught her attention. Richard noticed her looking at it. He picked up the photograph and stared at it for a long moment. Then he told Jasmine that the girl was his daughter, Emily. Emily had died from leukemia when she was only 8 years old. Richard had never recovered from the loss. He admitted that after Emily died, his marriage collapsed, and he buried himself in work. He built his company into an empire, but the success never filled the emptiness he carried inside. Jasmine listened without interrupting. She understood what it meant to lose someone and continue living with the things you never got to say. Richard began talking to her more after that day. He told her stories about Emily, the games they used to play, the books she loved, and the places she wanted to visit. For the first time in years, Richard was talking about his daughter without becoming angry. Jasmine noticed that whenever he talked about Emily, the harshness in his voice disappeared. One evening, Richard asked Jasmine why she was always helping everyone when she was struggling herself. Jasmine laughed softly and told him that sometimes helping someone else made her forget her own problems for a while. Richard looked at her and said that she reminded him of Emily. Jasmine didn't know what to say. Richard had spent years believing that the best way to protect himself from losing someone again was to keep everyone at a distance. But Jasmine had slowly broken through that wall without even trying. What she didn't know was that someone else in the hospital had been watching their relationship very closely. Nurse Tiffany Morgan had worked at the hospital for years, and she didn't understand why Richard trusted Jasmine so much. She had cared for wealthy patients before, and knew how much money could change people's behavior. Tiffany began questioning Jasmine's intentions. She wondered why Jasmine spent so much time in Richard's room, and why Richard had suddenly become cooperative with her. At first, Jasmine ignored the whispers. She had no reason to defend herself, because she knew the truth. She was simply doing her job. But the situation changed when Richard asked Jasmine for a favor that had nothing to do with his medical care. He wanted her to help him leave the hospital for one afternoon. He wanted to visit a place he hadn't seen in decades, a place connected to Emily. Jasmine agreed to help him make the arrangements, not knowing that the simple outing would reveal another side of Richard's past and bring a jealous coworker even closer to discovering what was happening between them. Richard's request surprised Jasmine because he had barely wanted to leave his hospital room since he was admitted. But this time, he was determined. He wanted to visit the park where he had taken Emily every Sunday when she was a child. Jasmine spoke with the doctor and the hospital administration, and after several arrangements were made, Richard was finally given permission to leave for a few hours. On Saturday morning, Jasmine arrived at the hospital wearing a simple blue dress instead of her nursing uniform. Richard was already waiting in a wheelchair. For the first time since Jasmine had met him, he looked genuinely excited. When they arrived at the park, Richard became quiet. He looked around at the trees, the walking paths, and the small playground nearby. Then he pointed toward a bench and told Jasmine that he and Emily used to sit there every Sunday. He remembered how she would run around the park, collect flowers, and insist that he play with her even when he was tired from work. Jasmine listened as he remembered every detail. Richard told her that Emily had once asked him why he worked so much. At the time, he had told her that everything he was building was for her future. He wanted to make sure she would never struggle. But now, sitting in the same park decades later, he admitted that he had finally understood what Emily had been trying to tell him. She didn't want a wealthy father. She wanted her father. Jasmine could see the regret in his face. She reminded him that he had loved his daughter, even if he had made mistakes. Richard didn't answer immediately. He simply looked toward the playground and said that if he could have one more day with Emily, he would give away every dollar he had just to hear her call him Dad again. After spending the afternoon walking through the park, Jasmine took Richard to a small restaurant nearby. He ordered the same chocolate dessert he used to buy for Emily. He laughed when Jasmine told him that he had probably spoiled her. For a few hours, Richard wasn't a dying billionaire, He was simply a father, remembering his little girl. Before they returned to the hospital, Richard gave Jasmine a small box. Inside was a simple silver bracelet. He told her it had belonged to Emily and that he wanted Jasmine to have it because she had reminded him that kindness could still exist in the world. Jasmine immediately tried to refuse, but Richard insisted. He told her that the bracelet had been sitting in a drawer for more than 40 years and that he wanted it to belong to someone who would appreciate what it represented. Jasmine accepted it with tears in her eyes. She thanked him and promised she would keep it safe. When they returned to the hospital, Tiffany saw the bracelet on Jasmine's wrist. She immediately became suspicious. She watched as Richard smiled at Jasmine before she left his room. From that moment, Tiffany became convinced that Jasmine was getting too close to him. She began telling other nurses that Jasmine was taking advantage of Richard's loneliness. Jasmine heard the rumors, but refused to respond. She knew she had done nothing wrong. What mattered to her was that Richard was finally eating, taking his medication, and talking again. But the rumors eventually reached the hospital supervisor. Jasmine was called into the office and asked directly about her relationship with Richard. She explained everything honestly. She said Richard had become like family to her, but she had never asked him for money or anything else. The supervisor believed her, but she warned Jasmine to be careful, because Richard's wealth made the situation complicated. Jasmine promised to keep professional boundaries. That evening, she returned to Richard's room. He noticed immediately that something was wrong and asked her what had happened. Jasmine didn't want to burden him, so she told him everything was fine. Richard knew she was hiding something, but he didn't push her. Instead, he reached for the photograph of Emily beside his bed. He stared at it for a moment and then told Jasmine that there was something he needed to tell her. It was something he had never told anyone at the hospital. He had been looking for someone for years, and recently, he had started to believe that person might still be alive. Jasmine listened carefully as Richard revealed that after Emily's death, there had been a disagreement between him and his wife's family. Something happened during Emily's final days that Richard had never been able to understand. He had always believed that he knew the whole story of his daughter's death, but a letter he discovered recently made him question everything. Richard told Jasmine that the letter had been written shortly before Emily died, but he had never received it until decades later. He had kept it hidden because he was afraid of what the truth might reveal. Jasmine asked him what the letter said. Richard looked at her for several seconds before answering. He told her that Emily had written about a person who had been helping her during her illness, someone Richard had never heard about. And now, after 40 years, Richard wanted to find out who that person was and why his family had kept the information from him. Jasmine realized that Richard's grief wasn't the only thing keeping him awake at night. There was something unresolved about his daughter's final days, and he was determined to uncover the truth before he died. The next morning, Richard asked Jasmine to help him find the letter. He had kept it inside a locked drawer in his home, but he was too weak to leave the hospital alone. Jasmine contacted his attorney, who arranged for someone to bring the documents to the hospital. When the envelope finally arrived, Richard held it for several minutes without opening it. He looked nervous. Jasmine could tell that whatever was inside had haunted him for decades. When he finally opened the letter, his hands began to shake. Emily had written it shortly before she died. She told her father that there was a woman named Grace Miller who had been visiting her during her treatment. Grace wasn't a doctor or a nurse. She was a volunteer who spent time with children in the cancer ward. Emily described Grace as kind, patient, and always willing to sit beside her when she was afraid. She wrote that Grace had become like a second mother to her. But there was something else in the letter. Emily had written that Grace knew something about Richard's family that she was afraid to tell him. Before Richard could read the rest, the letter suddenly stopped. There was no explanation, no goodbye, nothing about why Grace had disappeared. Richard remembered asking hospital staff about a volunteer named Grace after Emily died, but everyone told him there was no record of her. For 40 years, he had assumed that Grace was someone Emily had imagined or perhaps a temporary volunteer who had simply moved away. Now he wondered if someone had deliberately hidden her from him. Jasmine offered to help him investigate, but Richard refused at first. He didn't want her involved in something that could become complicated. Jasmine reminded him that he had spent his entire life carrying questions he never answered. If there was a chance of finally finding the truth, he deserved to take it. Richard agreed. His attorney began searching old hospital records, while Jasmine tried to remember everything Richard had told her about Emily's treatment. After several days, they finally found a name connected to the old hospital records. Grace Miller had worked as a volunteer during the same year Emily was receiving treatment. But there was another discovery. Grace had stopped volunteering only weeks before Emily died. Nobody knew why. Richard became determined to find her. The search eventually led them to a small town in Michigan. Grace was still alive. She was 74 years old and living quietly with her husband. When Richard's attorney contacted her, she initially refused to speak to him. But when she heard that Richard was dying, she agreed to meet him. The meeting was emotional. Grace recognized Richard immediately. She told him that she had wanted to speak to him 40 years earlier, but someone had warned her to stay away. Richard asked who had warned her. Grace hesitated before giving him the answer. It was his former brother-in-law, Emily's uncle. Grace explained that shortly before Emily died, Emily had told her that she was worried about her father. She believed Richard was working too much and blamed herself for keeping him away from home. Grace had tried to reassure her, but Emily had also told Grace something else. She had discovered that her uncle had been secretly taking money from Richard's company. Emily had found financial documents while looking through her father's office, and she planned to tell him. Grace believed that was why she was threatened, and told never to contact the family again. Richard was devastated. For decades, he had believed he had failed his daughter because he chose business over her. Now he realized there had been another reason why Emily had been so worried during her final days. She had been trying to protect him. Richard asked Grace why she never told him after Emily died. Grace explained that she was young, frightened, and had been threatened with losing her job and facing legal consequences if she spoke. She had carried the guilt for 40 years. Richard forgave her. He told her that he wished he had known the truth sooner, but he was grateful to finally understand what his daughter had been trying to tell him. When Richard returned to the hospital, something about him had changed. He was still sick, but he seemed lighter. He had spent years believing that his daughter died, thinking he didn't love her. Now he knew that wasn't true. Jasmine noticed the difference immediately. Richard told her that sometimes the truth doesn't change the past, but it can change the way you carry it. From that day forward, he stopped refusing his medication. He started eating regularly and asking the nurses about their lives. He even began talking about what he wanted to do with his remaining time. But while Richard was finding peace, Jasmine's problems outside the hospital were getting worse. Her landlord had given her a final deadline to pay the overdue rent. Her brother Marcus had been accepted into college, but the tuition deposit was due within days. Jasmine had no idea how she would afford it. Richard knew nothing about her financial problems because she had never asked him for help. She continued coming to work, taking care of him, and pretending everything was fine. One evening, Richard noticed the exhaustion in her face and asked her what was wrong. Jasmine finally admitted that she was worried about losing her home and that she didn't know how she would pay for Marcus's college deposit. Richard listened carefully. Jasmine expected him to offer money, but he didn't. Instead, he told her something she would remember for the rest of her life. He said that helping people should never make them feel indebted, and that there was a difference between accepting help and taking advantage of someone. Jasmine thanked him but refused to accept anything. Richard smiled and told her he respected her decision. But after she left the room, Richard made a phone call to his attorney. He told him that before he died, he needed to put something important in writing. He wanted to make sure Jasmine and her family would be protected, but he also wanted the decision to be made without Jasmine knowing.
Meanwhile, Tiffany continued watching Jasmine closely. She had noticed Richard's growing trust in her and believed something was happening behind closed doors.
She began telling people that Jasmine was trying to get into Richard's will. Soon, the rumor spread throughout the hospital. Jasmine had no idea that her reputation was about to be attacked by someone who had already decided she was guilty without knowing the truth. By the following week, the rumors about Jasmine had spread throughout the hospital. Some people stopped talking when she walked into the nurses' station, while others looked at her with suspicion. Jasmine tried not to let it affect her, but it became harder each day. She knew she had done nothing wrong, yet she could feel people judging her. Tiffany made the situation worse by telling anyone who would listen that Jasmine was spending too much time with Richard and that she was probably expecting something in return. Jasmine finally confronted her one afternoon and calmly told her to stop spreading lies. Tiffany laughed and said she was only warning people to be careful. Jasmine walked away because she refused to create a scene at work. She had more important things to worry about. Her landlord had given her 48 hours to pay the rent or leave the apartment. That evening, she returned home and found her brother and sister waiting for her. Marcus had received another letter from the college he wanted to attend, reminding him that his enrollment deposit was due the next morning. Aaliyah was sitting at the kitchen table trying to finish an assignment on an old laptop that kept shutting down. Jasmine looked around the apartment and realized how much her family depended on her. She promised Marcus that they would find a way. After everyone went to bed, Jasmine sat alone at the kitchen table and counted the money in her account. It wasn't enough for the rent, let alone Marcus's college deposit. She wiped away her tears and decided that she would work another double shift. The next morning, Jasmine arrived at the hospital exhausted. Richard immediately noticed something was wrong. He asked her why she looked like she hadn't slept. Jasmine tried to avoid the question, but Richard knew her well enough by then to see through the smile. She finally told him about the eviction notice and Marcus's college situation. Richard listened quietly. Then he asked her a simple question. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Jasmine explained that she didn't want him to think she was asking for money. Richard nodded. He told her that he understood. He then asked her to trust him enough to let him help in a way that wouldn't make her feel like she owed him anything. Jasmine still refused. She told him that she appreciated the offer, but she wanted to solve her family's problems herself. Richard smiled and told her that her determination reminded him of Emily. He said that his daughter had always hated asking for help too. Jasmine smiled at the comparison, but she still wouldn't accept money. Later that day, Richard's attorney arrived at the hospital. He stayed in Richard's room for nearly an hour. When he came out, he looked serious. Jasmine didn't know what they had discussed, and Richard didn't tell her. He simply asked her to promise that she would continue taking care of herself. That evening, Richard's health suddenly became worse. His breathing became difficult, and the doctors rushed into his room. Jasmine stood outside while the medical team worked to stabilize him. She had seen patients get worse before, but this time felt different. Richard was no longer just a patient to her. He had become someone she cared about deeply. After several hours, the doctors managed to stabilize him. When Jasmine entered his room, Richard was awake but extremely weak. He looked at her and smiled. He told her he was glad she was there. Jasmine sat beside him and held his hand. Richard told her that he had spent most of his life believing that success meant having more money, more businesses, and more power. But now that he was facing the end, he realized none of those things mattered as much as the people who stayed when there was nothing left to gain. Jasmine told him that he still had people who cared about him. Richard looked at her and said that he knew that now. He then asked Jasmine to do something for him. He wanted her to promise that if anything happened to him, she would never blame herself. Jasmine didn't understand why he was saying that, but she promised. Richard closed his eyes and rested. Meanwhile, Tiffany had managed to convince herself that Jasmine was hiding something. She began looking for evidence. She discovered that Richard had recently changed his estate documents and that his attorney had visited the hospital several times. Tiffany immediately assumed Jasmine was involved. She told Vanessa, Richard's niece, what she had heard. Vanessa became furious. She had always expected to receive a large part of Richard's estate, and the thought of Jasmine receiving anything made her angry. Vanessa demanded to know what Richard had changed. The attorney refused to discuss his client's private affairs. That only made Vanessa more suspicious. She began investigating Jasmine's background and learned about her financial struggles. To Vanessa, that was enough. She decided Jasmine had been using Richard's kindness to gain access to his money. The following morning, Vanessa came to the hospital and confronted Jasmine outside Richard's room. She accused her of manipulating a dying man. Jasmine was shocked. She told Vanessa that she had never asked Richard for money and never intended to. Vanessa didn't believe her. She warned Jasmine to stay away from her uncle and told her that if she discovered Jasmine was trying to take advantage of him, she would make sure Jasmine lost her job. Jasmine walked away without arguing. But the confrontation left her shaken. She began wondering whether continuing to care for Richard was causing more harm than good. That night, she told her supervisor that she was considering asking to be removed from his case. Before the supervisor could answer, Richard's attorney appeared at the nurse's station. He handed Jasmine a sealed envelope and told her that Richard had instructed him to give it to her only if she decided to leave his care. Jasmine stared at the envelope in confusion. She didn't understand why Richard had prepared something like this. She slowly opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. The first sentence made her stop breathing. "Jasmine, if you are reading this, then someone has made you believe that you don't belong in my life." She continued reading, unaware that the letter contained a decision Richard had already made about her future, and that his family would do everything possible to stop it. Jasmine continued reading the letter with trembling hands. Richard explained that he knew about the rumors, and that he had already spoken with his attorney about them. He told Jasmine that she had never once asked him for money, favors, or special treatment, and that was exactly why he trusted her. He wrote that during the final years of his life, he had met many people who wanted something from him, but Jasmine was the first person who seemed to care about him, without expecting anything in return. He also told her that he had made an important decision concerning his estate, but he didn't want her to know the details yet, because he didn't want money to change the relationship they had built. Jasmine finished the letter with tears in her eyes. She couldn't believe Richard had been thinking about all of this, while she was simply trying to take care of him. When she entered his room, Richard was awake. She walked to his bedside and asked him why he had written such a letter. Richard smiled weakly and told her that he wanted her to understand that she had nothing to be ashamed of. He said that people often judged what they couldn't understand, and he didn't want their opinions to make her question her own character. Jasmine told him that she had considered leaving his care because she didn't want to cause more problems for him. Richard immediately refused. He told her that she had become one of the few people he trusted completely, and he didn't want her to leave simply because other people were uncomfortable with their friendship. Jasmine agreed to stay. Over the next few days, Richard's health continued to decline, but his attitude remained peaceful. He spent more time talking about his daughter and less time talking about his regrets. He asked Jasmine about her dreams and discovered that she had always wanted to open a small community clinic where people who couldn't afford medical care could receive help. Jasmine had never told anyone about that dream because she thought it was unrealistic. Richard encouraged her to take it seriously. He told her that sometimes people spend too much time thinking about what they cannot afford and forget to think about what they can build. Jasmine smiled and thanked him. Richard then asked her to promise that she would never stop working toward that dream. She promised. Meanwhile, Vanessa was becoming increasingly desperate. She contacted Richard's attorney and demanded to know whether Jasmine was included in the will. The attorney refused to reveal anything before the proper time. Vanessa accused him of protecting Jasmine, but he calmly reminded her that Richard was still alive and capable of making his own decisions. Vanessa left the office furious. She then went to the hospital and confronted Richard directly. She told him that the entire family was worried about Jasmine's influence over him. Richard became angry for the first time in weeks. He told Vanessa that Jasmine had done more for him than his relatives had done in years. Vanessa accused him of being confused because of his illness. Richard told her that his illness had made him see people more clearly, not less. He asked her to leave his room. Vanessa walked out in tears, but she wasn't finished. Later that night, She called Tiffany. Together, they decided to find a way to prove that Jasmine had been manipulating Richard. Tiffany secretly checked the hospital schedule and discovered that Jasmine had been spending more time with Richard than most nurses because of his condition. She used the information to create the impression that Jasmine had been deliberately seeking access to him. Vanessa then contacted a lawyer of her own and began preparing to challenge anything Richard might leave to Jasmine. While all of this was happening, Jasmine remained unaware of their plans. She was focused on Richard's declining health. One evening, Richard asked Jasmine to sit beside him. He looked unusually serious. He told her that he was tired and that he didn't know how much time he had left. Jasmine tried to reassure him, but Richard stopped her. He told her that he wasn't afraid of dying anymore. What frightened him was leaving without saying everything he needed to say. He thanked Jasmine for giving him the chance to feel like a father again. Jasmine became emotional and told him that he had given her something too. He had shown her that family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about the people who chose to stay. Richard reached for her hand and told her that he considered her family. Jasmine cried as she held his hand. She knew she was going to lose him soon, but she didn't know exactly how soon. The following morning, Richard asked his attorney to bring the final version of his will to the hospital. He signed the documents with Jasmine's name nowhere in sight. Then he gave the papers back to his attorney and told him to keep everything confidential until after his death. That afternoon, Richard asked Jasmine to help him sit near the window. He wanted to see the sunset. They watched the sky change colors while he told her stories about Emily. He told her about her favorite songs, her favorite books, and the silly things she used to do as a child. Jasmine listened quietly. Before the sun disappeared, Richard looked at her and said that meeting her had been the greatest unexpected blessing of his life. Jasmine told him she was grateful to have known him. Richard smiled and closed his eyes for a moment. Jasmine thought he had fallen asleep. She didn't realize that his health had taken another serious turn. Later that night, the doctor told Jasmine that Richard's condition had become critical. His body was shutting down. Jasmine stood outside his room with tears streaming down her face. She wanted to stay, but the doctor told her Richard needed rest. Jasmine finally left, after promising she would return the next morning. Before she walked away, she looked back through the glass and saw Richard sleeping peacefully. She had no idea that it would be the last time she would ever see him alive. The next morning, Jasmine returned to the hospital as early as she could. She walked quickly toward Richard's room, but before she reached the door, she saw his doctor standing outside with a serious expression. Jasmine stopped. She already knew from his face that something had happened. Richard had passed away peacefully during the night. For a few seconds, Jasmine couldn't move. She stood there staring at the closed door, trying to accept that the man she had spoken to only hours earlier was gone. She entered the room slowly and found Richard lying peacefully beneath the blanket. His face looked calm, almost as if he were sleeping. Jasmine walked to his bedside and held his hand. She remembered the first day she had met him, when he refused to eat and told her to leave him alone. She remembered the stories he had told her about Emily, the afternoon they spent in the park, the chocolate dessert he had ordered because it reminded him of his daughter, and the promise she had made to continue pursuing her dream of opening a clinic. Jasmine cried quietly and thanked him for trusting her. She told him that she would never forget him and that she was grateful he had allowed her to become part of his life. Later that morning, the hospital staff gathered to remember Richard. Even the nurses who had once complained about him admitted that he had changed during his final weeks. He had become calmer, kinder, and more willing to speak to people. Jasmine returned home that evening, carrying the sadness with her. Her siblings immediately noticed something was wrong. She told them that Richard had passed away. Marcus hugged her, while Aaliyah sat beside her, and reminded her that Richard had been lucky to have someone who genuinely cared about him. Jasmine tried to focus on her family, but she couldn't stop thinking about him. 2 days later, Richard's attorney contacted her and asked her to attend a meeting. Jasmine assumed it was something related to his medical records, but when she arrived at the law office, she found Vanessa and several members of Richard's family already there. Vanessa looked at Jasmine coldly. Jasmine immediately felt uncomfortable. The attorney explained that Richard's final will would be read that afternoon. Vanessa told Jasmine that she had no reason to be there. The attorney calmly told her that Richard had specifically requested Jasmine's presence. The room became quiet. The attorney opened the document and began reading. Richard had left money to several charities and organizations that supported cancer research and children's health care. He had also provided for several employees who had worked for him for many years. Then the attorney reached the part that made Vanessa sit forward. Richard had left his family home to Jasmine. Vanessa immediately objected. She argued that Jasmine was only a nurse and had known Richard for a few months. The attorney reminded her that the will reflected Richard's wishes and had been legally prepared and witnessed. But there was more. Richard had established a foundation in Emily's name, and Jasmine had been named the director. The foundation would provide medical assistance and scholarships to families who could not afford treatment or education. Richard had also created an education fund for Marcus and Aaliyah. Jasmine covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. She had never asked Richard for any of this. She had never expected it. She only cared for him because she believed every patient deserved compassion. Vanessa became furious and accused Jasmine of manipulating Richard. She threatened to challenge the will in court. The attorney calmly informed her that Richard had anticipated that possibility. He had recorded a video explaining his decisions while he was still mentally capable of making them. The video was played in the room. Richard appeared on the screen, sitting in his hospital room. He looked weak but completely aware. He explained that he knew some people would accuse Jasmine of taking advantage of him. He said that was exactly why he had kept his decision private. He had watched Jasmine struggle with her own life while refusing every offer of financial help. He had seen how she treated him when she had nothing to gain. Richard said that Jasmine had given him something money had never been able to buy: peace. He explained that he wasn't leaving Jasmine his wealth because she was his nurse. He was doing it because she had become family to him. He then addressed Vanessa directly. He told her that he loved his family, but love did not mean allowing people to inherit something simply because they expected it. He wanted his fortune to create opportunities for people who needed them, just as he wished he had been able to do for Emily. The video ended with Richard looking directly into the camera. He said that Jasmine had reminded him that a person's final chapter could still have meaning. Vanessa sat silently. She had nothing to say. The will was eventually accepted, and the legal challenge never succeeded because Richard's documents were clear and properly prepared. Jasmine returned to the hospital several weeks later, but this time she wasn't there as Richard's nurse. She was there to begin working with the foundation. She kept the promise she had made to him. The foundation helped families with medical bills, provided scholarships to young students, and eventually opened a community health center named after Emily. Jasmine also used the opportunity to build the life she had always dreamed about. Marcus went to college. Aaliyah finished high school and began preparing for nursing school. Their family finally moved into a comfortable home without Jasmine constantly worrying about eviction. But despite everything she received, Jasmine never forgot why Richard had trusted her. She didn't see his inheritance as a reward. She saw it as a responsibility. Years later, Jasmine stood inside the community clinic during its opening ceremony. On the wall was a photograph of Richard and his daughter Emily. Beneath it were the words Richard had chosen for the foundation. Compassion is the greatest legacy a person can leave behind. Jasmine looked at the photograph and smiled through her tears. She knew Richard had entered her life when both of them were carrying different kinds of pain. He had lost a daughter, while she had lost her mother, and was struggling to protect her family. Somehow, they had found comfort in each other. Richard had spent most of his life believing that money could protect the people he loved. In the end, he discovered that what people remember isn't the size of your bank account or the number of businesses you own. They remember how you made them feel when they needed someone. Jasmine never expected to become the daughter of a billionaire. She never expected to inherit a house, a foundation, or a future she could never have afforded on her own. She simply walked into a hospital room and treated a lonely old man with kindness. And sometimes, that is how life changes. Not through chasing money, not through connections, not through luck. Sometimes, everything changes because you choose to be kind to someone when nobody is watching. Jasmine kept Richard's silver bracelet for the rest of her life. And every year on his birthday, she returned to the park where he had once taken Emily. She would sit on the same bench, look at the trees, and remember the man who had entered her life as a difficult patient and left it as the father she never expected to have. She always ended her visit the same way. She would look toward the sky and quietly say, "Thank you, Dad. I kept my promise." And then she would return to the clinic and continue the work Richard had trusted her to carry on. And that was the story of Jasmine and Richard, a reminder that kindness can change a life in ways we never expect. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe to Nenya Folktales, and turn on the bell for more emotional stories with powerful life lessons. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, sometimes the smallest act of kindness can leave the biggest legacy.